I want you to just start by imagining the end of capitalism. Just for a minute. Just imagine it. Does it make you feel panicked? Do you want to run out of the room and scream? If you study economics, not just that, politics, economics, social science, you'll spend most of your day in a situation of refusal to imagine the end of a system. I would argue that most of professional economics is premised on the permanence and impossibility of the permanence of capitalism and the impossibility of its disappearance. But I would like to argue that capitalism is a complex system. It's been an adaptive system, but it must logically have a beginning, a middle, and an end, like most things. Now, when asked to imagine the end of capitalism, a lot of people immediately start thinking about global warming and demographic aging. So you've got, global warming is happening, climate change is a reality, man-made climate change. You've got $4 trillion worth of assets in the capital markets sunk into carbon production. If these $4 trillion worth of capital are to be valorized, if they are to make profits, the world will burn. But if they don't burn the carbon, then those $4 trillion worth of assets are worthless. This is not me who says this. It's not some radical guy who supports Jeremy Corbyn saying this. This is the Bank of England says this. There are $4 trillion worth of capital assets that are effectively worthless if we prevent climate change. So that's one problem long-term for capitalism. Another one is demographic aging. Now, it's a contingent problem. It's a problem of rapidly developing the global south and rapidly developing our societies after World War II, so we get a blip of demographic aging that we are now living through, but it's still a real problem in the sense that you have got, say, Standard & Poor's, the credit rating agency. You've got the costs of healthcare, rising costs of healthcare, rising costs of social care for the elderly population compared to a smaller working population paying tax, means that probably, if nothing changes, if no more austerity and health service cuts can be pushed down onto the population, then the average debt to GDP ratio in 50 years will be 140%. And that means, according to Standard & Poor's, that a quarter of all sovereigns, a quarter of all national treasuries, their debt will be junk. Their credit rating will be the same as the worst possible credit rating you can get. The countries will be bankrupt. Now, these two problems, climate change and demographic aging, seem like exogenous or external shocks. But you should know that even if they are only external shocks, and of course in a way they are not external, capitalism created carbon burning, capitalism has created the demographic aging problem, but even if you see them as external, that doesn't mean capitalism cannot end. Because look at how the ways other societies have ended, other economic modes of production have ended entirely because of external shocks. If you think about the way the impact of just think about the end of Roman civilization, the collapse of the Roman Empire, as external tribes, we call them, societies, forms of economic production, took over from the slave and homestead mode of production that the Romans had. It can happen. Now, my thesis is that, yes, these two problems are real, but that the most basic problem is a reproduction problem within capitalism itself. It's a complex adaptive system which for 200 years has adapted, but it's losing its capacity to adapt. And the reason for this is the specific quality of information machines. Now, in 1602, Galileo wrote this amazing book, De Mechanicâ, on mechanics, which demystified machines. If you read the accounts of Galileo's contemporaries which to describe what machines do, they will say a machine is a device for overcoming the laws of nature, for defying the laws of nature. Galileo said, look, there's nothing mysterious going on in a machine. A machine doesn't create extra energy. It transforms energy from one form to another, but he said you cannot lift a heavy thing with a small force. In other words, the machine is simply a transformation engine for energy, and it's not defying the laws of nature, it is working according to the laws of nature. So 1602, Galileo demystifies the machine. 1776, Adam Smith does the same thing. Adam Smith says, look, all around us are mechanical workshops. Smith visited the mechanical workshops of Perth and Edinburgh in Scotland. And he said, you only have to go to one of these things to realise that the machines are not producing the value. It's the labour that is producing the value. Smith's labour theory of value, which is improved on by Marx and also by Ricardo, teaches us that there is no mysterious economic force inside a machine. It is not creating value. It is transforming that which creates the value, the work. And in fact, Galileo and Smith both effectively are telling us that an economy is human. An economy is not mechanical. Now, we have a third, and of course, even after the labour theory of value in economics is discarded, when marginalism takes over in the 1870s, marginalists do not bring back a theory of mysterious value-creating machines. It's gone forever once Smith and Ricardo do this, and the physiocrats actually, do this job of saying machines don't create value. But today we have a third task of demystification, I will argue, and that is in the sphere of understanding what information machines actually do. You know, Alan Turing's 1950 paper about artificial intelligence is brutally entitled Computing Machinery in Intelligence. It is a machine. And in Turing's time, of course, he built a physical analog machine to compute. So he was all too well aware, and we should be aware, that these things are just machines. That a silicon chip is a machine with 3 billion switches that don't move. That's all it is. Software is a machine. An executable line of computer code is a machine. We've grown up with the illusion in the last 30 years that these machines are in some way creating value, just as Smith's mechanics did. And we have an entire vocabulary to support the illusion. Virtual manufacturing, cognitive capitalism, intellectual property, immaterial wealth, and the massively expanded and incalculable and rather bizarre accounting category of intangible assets, which has massively expanded in the last 30 years. Look at the balance sheets of any company. Now, it's no accident that this lexicon of illusion appeared at the exact moment that we began to understand external existential threats like climate change and like aging, because human brains crave solutions. They crave, we really want there to be a solution. And I would argue that if information machines really were creating quote-unquote intangible wealth, then that might be a solution. It might be a solution for how we pay off the 140% of GDP debts. That's 257 trillion debt, public, private, and corporate, that hangs over us today, could be paid off if the information machines would create a whole new era of value creation in capitalism. That's why the illusion is there. But I will argue that it is an illusion. So the thesis of post-capitalism, the book I wrote in 2015, is that there's no mysterious economic wealth emanating from a computer, that information has to be physically represented, and it is in economic terms physical. The revolutionary potential of information technology, which the previous speaker talked about, is real. It massively speeds up and simplifies the production of physical things. It industrializes the creation of organizational and logical and scientific solutions. It creates new challenges for the human brain so that it actually improves human-only productivity. My productivity as a writer is massively expanded by my ability to use information tools on this machine. It creates, in other words, what Marx would have called use value, utility, on a massive scale. And if you like, information machines create self-expanding use value. If you, very early discovered, computers that can program themselves, code that can produce code, programs that can write symphonies. This is use value being self-expanded in a way that didn't quite happen with a machine, a press, and a machine tool. These things can do amazing things, and they can do especially amazing things when they're controlled by a computer, and the computer sees the feedback loop, and you don't need a person at all. I did the job of being a press operative when I was 18, and we made a lot of mistakes and gave a lot of excuses. And the excuses were excellent, even if the product we made was not excellent. But today, this process is completely automated. And therefore, yes, it produces much, much more utility. But there are 4 economic effects, I will argue, of information technology, which the functional economics of mainstream capitalism just cannot, well, it's struggling to understand. The 4 effects I want to talk about, remind me how much time I've got left.
35 minutes.
Super. Are the zero marginal cost effect, the separation of work from wages, the creation of massive positive externalities through network effects, and the amplified asymmetry of information in the economy. So, falling price, reduced relationship of work to wages, network effects, and information asymmetry. I think these 4 things are each worth, an entire day school or a PhD in their own right, and I will simply zip through what I think is happening with each one. Now, the zero marginal cost effect was first theorized by Paul Romer in 1990, and its ability to transform business models and society discussed widely in the 1990s. Kevin Kelly and Wired and numerous articles and books. Most recently, it's been sort of owned and claimed by a business theorist called Jeremy Rifkin. But it's an old idea. It's a relatively old idea. And it simply is that information goods are different. Whatever the cost of production for an information good, the reproduction cost under market conditions should fall not to zero, but towards zero. Because information goods are different in the sense that they are non-rival. If I park my car in a parking space, you can't park your car in that parking space. If I am driving my car, you cannot drive it at the same time. This is not true with information goods. It is also true that information goods can be used with relatively little or almost no wear and tear. A vinyl record obviously gets scratches, so does a CD. The file in Cupertino, California, on Apple servers of your favorite rock album or classical symphony does not. There is some wear and tear to the server it sits on, and it uses energy and it has mass. But we are talking about infinitesimally smaller amount of wear and tear per listen compared to your vinyl record. And these properties of information goods are important because it allows us to share them. And they are naturally shareable, and almost I naturally rebel against ownership. However, they can be owned. as long as we impose a legal form of ownership on them. So Roma goes through, in 1990, obviously, much more earlier iteration of information technology he's imagining and working through. He says, you can put codes in a music file to prevent people from copying it. You can. You can arrest the guy in the car park of the supermarket who's selling copied CDs and DVDs, and you can do that. You can have an information lawyer, and there are lots of these now, and you can write a special contract saying that no one should pirate your music. You can extend copyright. That's a big thing that's happening at the moment. Extend copyright from 20 years to 25 to 50 to 70. Lots of that. Lots of states are under pressure to do all that. You can do all that. But there's a really interesting problem here. That is, our law, capitalism, and most commercial societies, including the market sector in feudal societies, used the principle of Roman law to define property, which is possession. You remember, possession is 9/10 of the law. It is a saying. Roman law was based on possession. And we have adopted that. If you possess it, if I take a piece of paper, fold it up in a beautiful origami shape, like the one in Blade Runner, and that piece of paper is already mine, and the labor was mine, this beautiful origami shape is mine, isn't it? That's my thing. I can sell it to you. It seems natural to us. But if when I produce information goods, like I'm producing now, somebody maybe records this, it's an audio file, it can be uploaded to the internet. Do I own that audio file? Well, unless I've made a contract with you in advance, I don't really, do I? And so it's not natural for an information good to be owned through possession, and therefore we have to impose ownership on it. Now, we know what happens to economic systems that have to be reinvented every morning by bureaucrats and lawyers, and whose rules have to be imposed through explicit laws rather than implicit practices, because we know what happened to the Soviet Union. We know that economies organized by, as it were, command and law are not so survivable as economies that appear from spontaneous practices and where the law is based on the spontaneous property of the good, which is, I can own it. Information goods are just hard to own privately. Now, the first impact of this collapse of reproduction costs towards zero happens, of course, in the sphere of information goods themselves. So if you look at a graph of the price per megabit or megabyte of bandwidth, storage, and processing power, it all collapses exponentially in the last 20 to 30 years. Deloitte, the consultancy, calls these technologies exponential technologies and claims that unlike, for example, steel or electricity or aircraft manufacture, the price will go on falling forever. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but to get a mainstream capitalist consultancy to write in 2013 that the price falls in information goods are exponential and will never stop is quite a rupture, I would argue, in the history of capitalism. In no previous era of the 200 years have we had serious thinkers on whose decisions and writings money is placed, claiming that a technology has reached exponential takeoff stage. So, but even if you say, okay, that's going a bit too far, let's just stick with the idea that these exponential falls have happened, they have happened. But now they've cascaded over into the world of the production of real physical things. So I interviewed an aircraft designer who worked on the British fighter bomber called a Tornado. It's a NATO fighter bomber. They'd just gone out of... they were in the first Gulf War, but not much in the second Gulf War. He worked on the tail fin of this Tornado fighter bomber and told me that using the finite element method of stress testing the metal, they were able to do 12 stress tests mathematically on the model, on the design, before they started to manufacture the prototype. At the end of his career, he worked on the tail fin of the Typhoon, the Eurofighter, which replaced this. And this time, using computers, they did the same stress test 186 million times. So that's quite a difference in one person's lifetime. And the result is that, those of you who are in engineering will know, that the process of engineering, where much of the work and design is done virtually, where a wing is flown 186 million times, and the stress on the smallest brass screw inside it is calculated using millions of data points per centimetre, using supercomputers over and over and over again. This has an impact on the physical production, the physicality of the aircraft, and the cost of producing the aircraft, so that the mistakes are made in the virtual world, not on the production prototype. Now, the collapsing price of information, in other words, is happening both to information goods and to physical goods, and therefore, of course, also to labour. The cost of reproducing labour will fall, and is falling. I would argue that the sheer number of people in advanced countries who are on or just above the minimum wage, if we didn't have minimum wages, we would be living through a much more, as it were, accurate experiment of we would get much more accurate information about how and where this collapsing cost of information, collapsing production cost of physical goods is actually affecting the cost of reproducing labour, but minimum wages mask this. So, okay, normally capitalism has an answer to this problem, and this has happened before in previous periods of automation. Normally what happens is that innovators and entrepreneurs find ways of creating things with a lot of labour. Things that need a lot of skilled labour and know-how to make them, and cannot be made easily by machines. This is the classic adaptation process of capitalism, and what does it do? It creates new goods, it creates new needs. So if you invent the automobile, everybody eventually needs an automobile, because you can't get around to the places you need to without one. And then it creates a new higher skilled and therefore higher paid workforce. This is what explicitly Henry Ford understood he was doing in Fordism. And it works usually. And this is usually why Marxist accounts of capitalism's demise are wrong. See, Rosa Luxemburg, the Marxist economist of the German Social Democratic Party before World War I, wrote a book called The Accumulation of Capital, where she predicted the demise of capitalism because capitalism would run out of external markets to conquer, colonies. While she was writing the book, the number of movie theatres in Berlin grew from 1 to 150 in 2 years. That was the market. You forget colonies. Capitalism is usually capable of creating internal new markets much more efficiently than it creates external ones. So it colonizes new areas of human activity to commercialize. And that's also the normal process of adaptation. But my argument is that the collapsing price of information, the collapsing price of real things, or rather the collapsing cost of production of real things, is a fundamental and unavoidable thing if you have information technology, and therefore you get the first of the big spontaneous counteracting tendencies. Those of you who know Marxism will know that Marx built into his analysis of capitalism the idea of a tendency and a spontaneous counter-reaction, which itself works in an equal and opposite way and creates the thing, creates the model. Now, I think this is a useful mental image when we think about what capitalism is going through now with information technology. Because post-capitalism, the book and the thesis, does not say we go from downward pressure on reproduction costs and production costs to a post-capitalist world. No, it says there is a spontaneous counter-reaction to this by capital itself. And what is it? It's the creation of enormous monopolies. We are living through the creation of monopolies on a scale that even in the monopoly era of monopoly capitalism before World War I were unimaginable. Single sector monopolies. And what is their purpose? Their purpose is to suppress competition. Just as the original monopolists argued, competition is bad, it destroys value, said the pre-war monopolists of the United States, and it suppresses price formation. There's no better example than the old iTunes model. It's gone now, but 99 cents or 99p, whatever it was in Norwegian, I don't know, 99 something per track. Supply doesn't come into it, demand doesn't come into it, quality doesn't come into it, wear and tear doesn't happen. You used to be able to go into a junk shop and find an old single, 45 RPM single, and it would either be almost valueless or very valuable, depending on whether it was the original Beatles 1963 copy of Let It Be, for example. Supply and demand came into the physical good, but it never came into the price formation of an iTunes track. It was just a monopoly price. It's the classic example of monopoly price formation. Now, I would argue that this monopoly, this creation of these giant monopolies, is not being primarily done as it was in the old monopolies to suppress innovation. That's not primarily what's going on. It's just to suppress price competition and prevent the natural fall of prices in a market economy of information goods towards zero. If you think of a heavily monopolized sector in classical economics, it's a four-player sector. This is a British banking system, the British supermarket system, 4 players. If you look at, say, the production of turbofans, the jet engines, there's 4 main players, and amazingly, they all own bits of each other. That's quite a monopolized. Well, they all have to produce more or less the same thing. You can stick onto any airframe, which just happens to be one of 2 monopolized, no 3. Boeing, Airbus, and Bombardier. We've got Bombardier being heavily repressed by the Americans to try and prevent it becoming the 3rd monopoly player. But in information, it's 1 player per sector. Facebook and Google and Amazon and Alibaba do not compete with each other. They compete at the edges. Very perfunctorily, they compete at the edges, but they're designed as single-sector monopolies. Uber and Airbnb don't compete with each other. All they exist to do is to prevent the emergence of 2 things. 1, competition, Uber versus Lyft in California, and 2, to smash up all previous folk or craft forms of economics, as Uber exists to do. Uber exists to prevent the emergence, I would argue, of a sharing or non-capitalist city transport system. It exists simply to make sure that the artificial intelligences that will control transport in 50 years' time are all private. That's the business. That's the bet. That's the business model. But Uber doesn't exist to compete with Airbnb. It's quite happy for Airbnb to be a monopoly of informal room sharing, while it is the monopoly of informal ride sharing. That's what they call it, ride sharing. It's not even a taxi service. And I think you've banned it, which is good for you. Which kind of brings me to my point about what we do about these things in a minute. Of course, the other thing is that the frightening thing is that the market capitalization of all these single sector monopolies actually suggests that they must take each other over, that they must control the entire world. If you have invested in Google, which is currently trying to get its hands on all kinds of public data, or if you've invested in Amazon, which owned Whole Foods supermarkets in America, took over that, what you are really investing in, what your bet, your risk, you've put capital at risk over a question. The question is, can Amazon control the world? Can Google control the world? Can Google take over the health service in Britain? Can Amazon take over the postal service in Britain? That's the capital at risk, because eventually the ultimate question is, can they all own each other? That's a really frightening question that I will leave you to ponder. Okay, Now, another outcome of the rapid and supersized monopolization of the world that is going on in order to resist what should naturally be happening to prices is the move of capital from production to rent-seeking. The previous speaker talked about this and talked about how we might have solutions for that by recognizing the rent-seeking of modern capitalism as basically something based on social. We do things socially. It seeks rent from those activities, so why shouldn't we have part of it? Well, the reason why we can't have part of it is because that's the model of capitalism. That's how people get rich. Not by investing, I would argue, putting capital at risk primarily anymore into profit production. Remember, productive capital isn't just production of things. It's the production of profit through commercial activity. And instead, an entire generation, you're all worried about what your kids do when they're eating their dinner, they're doing this, they're sort of looking at their phone all the time. You're all worried about that. What you should really also be worried about is a generation of quote-unquote entrepreneurs leaving business school, leaving university, who think being a business person is creating a rent-seeking opportunity. How do I get 5 houses and create rent on them? How do I monopolize the taxi service of a city and force everybody to use my app? That's what they're all asking, rather than how do I innovate a product? That too is one of the symptoms of what's going on. Now, to move quickly to the other 3, automation. Okay, so we looked at price. Automation. The potential for automation is clear. Fry and Osborne, the researchers at the Oxford Martin Institute, predicted in 2013 that about half of all jobs are susceptible to automation in the next 30 years. And this includes middle-class jobs, like commercial law. Commercial law, lots of decisions are being made by algorithm. If I go to my GP, my local doctor in Britain, they are increasingly making diagnostic decisions from a computer screen. It's quite hard to get them to look at you because they're quite keen on the computer screen. Well, the sad news for that doctor is that sooner or later the computer screen and me will communicate without the intermediary of this guy being paid £100,000 a year to look at the screen and tell me I have a cold. It's the same in commercial law, and it's increasingly the same where I work in journalism. But actually, automation isn't happening that fast. And Peter Drucker, the management theorist, taught us to look very closely at what goes on at work. He said the first person who really did this was Taylor, Frederick Winslow Taylor, in the 1890s. If you look closely at what goes on at work, really interesting things can be found out. Drucker said from Aristotle to Karl Marx, they wrote about work, but they never really interested themselves in work. Now, if we do this, what do we find? In skilled jobs, in relatively skilled jobs, work and non-work are really mixed up. You are no longer timing yourself on hours of work. You're being rewarded for outcomes, for targets. This is why if you go to the classic, software development house, the software, the coding factory, you'll find the guitars and the football tables and the bean bags, we call them, the soft furnishings you can sit on, and people wander around, and the dog is wandering around. Why? Because they work to targets. They're not being paid for how many hours of computer coding have you done today. They're being paid for how many things have you achieved. And the reverse of that is, while they're allowed to do, like book a holiday, go fix up a date or whatever while they're in work, that when they are not in work, when they're in the bar later, their phone goes and they have to do work. This is modern life. And if we look closely at it, it's clear that work, hours of work, and wages are being detached. Now, the potential for automation, I would argue, is huge, but for some reason, the spontaneous reaction of the system, I would argue both lawmakers and business leaders have done this, is to create millions of jobs that don't need to exist. That, as David Graeber, the British anthropologist, calls it, are bullshit jobs. Jobs that really do not need to exist are being created spontaneously because we cannot think of a social system that could facilitate the rapid implementation of the automation that is possible. So that's a sort of action-reaction process. I will skip to the third one, which is the externalities. The creation of positive externalities. However, just to pause, if you think about the economy I'm describing, huge monopolies, suppressing price formation, boosting asset wealth as the primary form of being rich. And then alongside it, a massive workforce of low-paid, low-skilled people pretending to work and their bosses pretending to pay them, as the Soviet Union used to say. This is a picture of maybe not Norway, but it is a picture of a classic neoliberal city. And what you would have to ask if you were kind of a Martian in a spaceship is, what's the sustainability of that? What is it that sustains high asset wealth and rent seeking alongside low pay and low skill? Well, it is, of course, the endless money creation. And I would argue that the adoption by capitalist governments and central banks of an open-ended money creation strategy is yet another proof of the provisional correctness of what I'm arguing. But if you go to the third impact, and we'll deal with this really briefly, of the network effect. When we interact, if we're all on our phones now together, if you're talking about me and then later I talk about this experience, we will create an information pool that is more valuable to us as an instant community, as a swarm, than it would have been had just we talked to each other one-on-one. It would take me a long time to talk to you all one-on-one. We are creating a cloud of information as we interact. The point about that cloud of information is that it does two things. It creates instant utility, instant usefulness to ourselves. If, for example, the network effect was well known and written about by Theodore Weil, the boss of Bell Telecoms in 1909, the more nodes on a network, the more useful it is to the people on it. And the people who tried to quantify this in the 1970s said, when they started really thinking about the economics of networks, is that it's exponential. The value of a network is exponential compared to as people join it. But then they asked, well, where's the monetary value? How do we quantify the monetary value of network interaction? Well, the way that it's being quantified at the moment is for corporations like Google or Amazon or Facebook to own everything we do. Everything in the cloud of information we've produced together is owned by them, and they monetize that. They take the externality, because in our interactions, if I buy from Amazon, or via Amazon, from Amazon, you can buy from Amazon a book. There's nothing in the contract that says, really, Amazon must have the right to valorize everything that we do together, the millions of people who buy this book and our reactions to it and who we are and how long do we read it. That apparently Thomas Piketty's beautiful and superb book, Capital in the 21st Century, the average page on which people stop reading it is page 27. I don't know what the average page where people stop reading my book is, but the only reason I know that is because somebody from Amazon told me. Because they can see where you stop reading every book, which bit you underline. You know this, bit you underline on your Kindle reader. 189 people have underlined this bullshit sentence from Bill Gates' memoirs. They know that. So the wisdom of the crowd is quantifiable now and marketable. But here's the problem. Nothing in the physical creation of that cloud of wisdom, cloud of utility, cloud of data, says that it must be owned only by one party to the transaction. It's social knowledge. It is created socially by all of us. It's not created individually by all of us. It's created through our interaction. So there is a problem of who owns that. And of course, the business models of all these massive monopolies are all based on the idea of capturing the value in the externality. I would argue that all that does, it creates a social question mark. Who should own it? and that question mark is not the same, I would argue, as the question mark that was in the heads of, say, the Luddite machine breakers or the early factory workers. Because if you went to a factory worker in the 1820s, they're all reading Ricardo, yeah? In England, they're all reading Ricardo's Political Economy to try and work out exactly how much profit should the capitalists be getting. That's what the early socialist workers were interested in my town, Manchester. And they admitted that because the capitalists had built the factory, they should get a profit. And it was kind of logical to them. And the question was, how much profit should the capitalists be earning? Are they earning more than they should? Was this the content of socialism? But the content of post-capitalism is different. The content, or the suggestion behind post-capitalism, is there is nothing in the relationship of Amazon to Amazon's pile of data, apart from the fact that it owns the servers on which that data is created, that should allow them to own that. Now, I think I've probably come to an end here, and say one final thing. From this proposal, falling price, automation, collective ownership of information, flows my proposal for a transition beyond capitalism. There's no need to tie it down to one form, one party, one class, one sort of wing of politics. I think we should discuss it as a project neutrally first, and then fight over the class interests and the different outcomes of it. But what I did in the book is to explain that it is possible to rapidly automate society, to collectively own the externalities, to use the downward pressure on price that is implicit in information technology to rapidly make the amount of work we need to do on this planet to keep ourselves alive much smaller than ever before. And my argument is simply, if you cannot imagine that happening outside capitalism, you're going to have a very difficult time making it happen. Because at the moment, all the structures of capitalism are there to prevent it, to prevent the collective ownership of information, to prevent the cheapening of most things that we need, and to prevent automation actually rapidly occurring. So that's the premise. And over to you. Thank you.
Right.